The night air in Virginia Beach was thick with humidity, the kind that clung to skin and made the world feel heavy and slow. A faint wind brushed through the trees along Maplewood Drive, carrying the distant scent of the ocean. It should have been an ordinary summer evening in 1987, the kind where the neighborhood kids chased fireflies and adults sat on their porches with cold drinks in hand. But by 10:47 p.m., that fragile calm was shattered. The first 911 call came from a woman named Margaret Lewis who lived 3 houses down. She told the dispatcher that she'd heard something, a scream that sliced through the night like glass breaking. Moments later, she saw lights flicker in the Carter house, followed by a crash that made her heart drop. Within minutes, the faint wail of sirens began to rise, growing louder until the red and blue flashes painted every window on the block. Officer Raymond Knox was the first on scene. He'd been with the department for 12 years, and in that time he'd seen more than he cared to remember. But something about this call had made his stomach tighten. Maybe it was the tone in the dispatcher's voice, or maybe it was the eerie stillness that hung over the house when he pulled up. The front door was ajar, the screen door gently creaking in the wind. He could smell something metallic even before he stepped inside. Blood, he thought, before he even saw her. The living room was dimly lit, the television flickering with static from a late-night broadcast. On the floor, near the old floral-patterned couch, lay a girl. She couldn't have been more than 17. Her long blonde hair was matted against her cheek, her skin pale and cooling under the artificial glow. The first thing Knox noticed was her hand, fingers still curled as if she had tried to grab something or someone. The phone was just inches away, its cord stretched taut across the floor, the receiver off the hook. A single word had been scrawled in red smudge near the wall, though it was unclear if it was written or just part of the chaos. Knox crouched down, his hand trembling as he checked for a pulse he already knew wasn't there. The girl was gone. Her eyes were half open, staring at the ceiling fan that turned lazily overhead. In that moment, everything went quiet. The sirens outside faded. The voices of approaching officers muffled into background noise. All he could hear was the hum of the TV and the faint buzzing of a fly near the lamp. He whispered something under his breath, maybe a prayer, maybe just disbelief, and stood up slowly. Then he saw him, sitting on the porch steps, his body hunched over and his hands stained with dark, drying blood, was a man in his 40s. His shirt was torn, his eyes vacant, his mouth moving without sound. When Knox stepped closer, he could hear the man whispering over and over, "Emily, Emily, please wake up." The words were hoarse, choked by something that sounded like both guilt and grief. Knox recognized him immediately. William Carter, a local mechanic, quiet, hard-working, known by nearly everyone in the neighborhood. The kind of man who fixed your car for half the price if you couldn't afford the full bill. Who lent out his tools and never asked for anything in return. Knox had seen William and Emily together many times before. He remembered how William used to wait in his truck after school to pick her up. How he'd wave to the neighbors as she climbed in, laughing about something or other. Everyone said he was devoted to his daughter, especially after his wife's death. That devotion was part of what made this scene so incomprehensible. Knox knelt in front of him. "William," he said gently, "I need you to look at me." But William didn't move. His eyes were fixed somewhere far away, lost in whatever had just happened. Knox reached out and took his arm, but the man flinched violently, pulling back as though burned. "She wouldn't listen," William muttered. "She wouldn't stop." "I didn't mean—" His words collapsed into a sob. By then, 2 more officers had arrived. They moved past Knox into the living room, confirming what he already knew. One called for the medical examiner, another for backup. Flashlights swept across the carpet, across framed family photos, across the half-empty glass of iced tea on the table. Everything in the house spoke of ordinary life, until you noticed the details that no longer fit. The overturned lamp, the broken picture frame near the couch, the thin streak of blood on the wall that led from the hallway to the living room. Neighbors began gathering outside, their faces pale and anxious under the streetlights. Margaret Lewis stood at the edge of her yard, clutching her robe closed with trembling hands. She kept whispering, "That poor girl. That poor girl." Next to her, an older man shook his head and muttered, "That's Bill Carter's house. He's a good man. He'd never—" But the words trailed off. No one could finish the thought. Inside, the medical examiner arrived, a small woman named Dr. Carolyn Shaw. She worked quietly, carefully, her expression unreadable as she examined the body. "Female, approximately 17, she said softly. "Multiple contusions to the head and upper torso. Signs of struggle." Her voice was calm, detached, but her eyes lingered on the girl longer than usual. She saw the pictures on the mantel. The same girl smiling beside a man with kind eyes, their arms around each other at the beach. The contrast was unbearable. As the scene unfolded, Knox took in every detail. The house smelled faintly of gasoline and motor oil, a reminder of William's work. There were papers on the counter, college brochures, application forms, letters from universities. Emily's dreams had been laid out right there, neatly stacked and waiting. He imagined her sitting at that very table, filling them out, excited about the future, and then something had gone wrong. Something so terrible it had ended in this. When they finally placed William in handcuffs, he didn't resist. He stood up slowly, his eyes red and unfocused. "She was my baby," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I just wanted her to listen." His words hung in the air like smoke, heavy and impossible to breathe. Knox looked away. There was no answer that could make sense of it. The ride to the station was silent. William sat in the back seat of the patrol car, staring out the window as they drove past familiar streets. Every corner, every tree seemed to remind him of her. The playground she used to run through. The diner where they'd eat breakfast on Sundays. The school where he once waited in line to pick her up. All those ordinary places now felt like ghosts. Back at the house, detectives continued to work through the night. They photographed everything, the phone, the blood spatter, the overturned furniture. Each image was a frozen moment of tragedy. By dawn, the sun rose pale and pink over the quiet street, washing the house in light that made it look almost peaceful again, as though it were trying to hide what had happened inside, but nothing could hide it. The story spread quickly through Virginia Beach that morning. A father had killed his own daughter. People spoke in whispers at the grocery store, at church, in the break rooms of local shops. Some said it must have been an accident. Others said William had snapped. No one could agree, but everyone felt the same chill. The realization that even the safest homes could hold the darkest secrets. Later that day, as officers cleared the scene, Knox stood on the porch one last time. The air had cooled, and for a moment he just listened. The neighborhood was quiet again, but it wasn't the same kind of quiet as before. It was heavier now, filled with something unseen and unspoken. He looked down at the small bloodstain on the wooden step, still damp, and thought of how many times that father and daughter must have sat there together, laughing, unaware that it would all come to this. Then he closed his notebook, took a deep breath, and walked away, leaving behind a house that would never be just another home again. The day before Emily Carter's death had started like any other. The sun rose over Chesapeake, lighting the small mechanic shop on Battlefield Boulevard where William Carter worked 6 days a week. The shop smelled of grease and gasoline, with the radio always humming in the background. William had owned Carter's Auto Repair for nearly 10 years, and he took pride in every repair he made. His hands were rough, his nails permanently stained black, but he worked with precision, the kind of care that came from a man who had built his life around fixing broken things. Yet the one thing he couldn't fix was his own home. He had always been known as the quiet one, polite but distant, the kind of man who kept his pain to himself. When his wife Laura died in a car accident in 1982, the light went out of him. Emily was only 12 then, and she became his world overnight. Neighbors remembered how he doted on her, how he packed her lunches, drove her to school, and stood alone at every parent-teacher meeting. He was proud of her grades, her smile, her bright spirit. People said he was a good father, maybe too protective at times, but who could blame him? Losing Laura had made him afraid of losing anyone else. By the time Emily turned 17, that protectiveness had turned into something heavier. She had grown into a confident, curious young woman who wanted independence. She was applying to colleges, dreaming of studying journalism in Richmond or maybe even Washington, D.C. She wanted to see the world beyond Virginia Beach and Chesapeake. William, however, couldn't bear the thought of her leaving. He told her it was too soon, too far, too dangerous. He said he just wanted to keep her safe. Emily saw it differently. She saw a man who couldn't let go. A man who was suffocating her with love that had turned into control. That summer, Emily met Ryan Mitchell, a 19-year-old who worked part-time at the hardware store near the auto shop. Ryan was the kind of boy who laughed easily, with a reckless smile and a motorcycle that made him seem older than he was. Emily liked that he treated her like an adult, not a child under constant watch. They started spending time together after school, first as friends, then as something more. When William found out, everything changed. It started with arguments, small at first, then louder, sharper, until they filled the house like thunder. William told her Ryan was trouble, that he only wanted one thing, that she was throwing her future away. Emily shouted back that she wasn't a little girl anymore. Sometimes their shouting matches would spill out into the yard, where the neighbors could hear but pretended not to. One evening, Margaret Lewis heard William yell, "You're all I have left," followed by the sound of something breaking. She thought about calling the police, but then the house went quiet. It always went quiet after. That Friday, William came home late from the shop. He was exhausted, covered in oil and sweat, and he found Emily sitting on the porch steps, her suitcase at her feet. She told him she was going to spend the weekend with a friend. He saw through the lie immediately. "You mean with him?" he said. She didn't deny it. For a moment, they just stared at each other, the silence stretching between them like a fault line ready to break. "Emily," he said finally, "I can't let you throw your life away." She laughed bitterly. "You can't stop me forever, Dad. I'm not Mom. You can't lock me inside this house and call it love." The words hit him like a slap. He turned away, unable to look at her, his jaw tight. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in his recliner, the TV on but silent, staring at the dark window. He saw flashes of Laura in Emily's face, the same stubbornness, the same fire. He remembered how Laura used to challenge him, how she'd once accused him of being too controlling even before Emily was born. And now, 5 years after her death, he was hearing those same words again from his daughter. The thought twisted something deep inside him. He had tried to be a good father, but somewhere along the way, fear had taken over. The fear of being alone, the fear of losing what little family he had left. The next morning, Emily left early, not telling him where she was going. He spent the day pacing the house, his mind racing between anger and worry. By evening, she still hadn't come home. He called her friends, her school, even Ryan's workplace, but no one had seen her. When she finally walked through the door around 10 that night, her hair windblown, cheeks flushed, and eyes tired, William's relief was mixed with fury. He asked where she'd been, but she brushed past him without a word. That's when he saw the faint bruise on her arm and the smell of alcohol on her clothes. "Emily, what did you do?" he asked, his voice shaking. She turned around, her eyes red from crying. "I went out. I had fun." "That's not a crime." He stepped closer, his voice rising. "You're 17. You can't be out drinking with that boy." She laughed bitterly. "You think Ryan made me do it? You think everything bad in my life is someone else's fault?" His face turned red. "You've changed. You're not the same girl your mother raised." That's when she snapped. "Maybe that's because she's dead and I've been stuck here with you." The words hung in the air like a blade. William froze. He saw the regret flash in her eyes the moment she said it, but it was too late. The pain that crossed his face wasn't anger. It was heartbreak. "Don't you ever say that again," he whispered. "Don't you ever talk about her like that." Emily stepped back, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean—" But he interrupted her, shouting now, tears welling in his eyes. "You think I don't miss her every day? You think I don't wake up and see her face in yours?" The fight escalated. Voices rose. Something crashed in the kitchen. A chair toppled over. Neighbors would later say they heard screaming, the kind that made your stomach twist, followed by a sharp thud and then silence. Inside, William's rage had turned into something blind and desperate. He grabbed Emily's wrist, trying to stop her from leaving, but she pulled away, her nails scratching his arm. "Let me go," she cried. He didn't. He couldn't. His grip tightened, and when she pushed him back, his hand swung before he could think. The sound of the blow echoed through the room. She stumbled, hitting the edge of the table before collapsing to the floor. For a moment, everything stopped. William stood there, breathing hard, staring at what he'd done. "Emily?" he whispered. She didn't move. He dropped to his knees beside her, shaking her shoulder, begging her to wake up. When he saw the blood, panic set in. He ran to the phone, tried to call for help, but his hands were shaking too much. The receiver slipped from his grip, clattering against the floor. He pressed his hands to her chest, trying to stop the bleeding, whispering her name over and over. But she didn't respond. Outside, the street was silent again. The neighbors who had heard the shouting didn't yet know that tragedy had unfolded just beyond their fences. Inside that small white house, a father knelt beside his daughter, his mind unraveling as the reality sank in. The clock on the wall ticked past 11. The television flickered quietly, casting shadows across the room. And in that haunting stillness, William Carter began to understand that he had become the very thing he feared most. A man who had destroyed the only piece of his world he had left. The interrogation room was cold, the kind of cold that seeped into the bones and made the air feel heavy. The fluorescent light above flickered softly, humming like a heartbeat. William Carter sat at the metal table, his hands cuffed, his eyes red-rimmed and swollen. He hadn't spoken much since the arrest. Every so often he would ask the same question in a hollow voice. Is she really gone? Detective Linda Harris, a woman with 20 years on the force and a reputation for patience, sat across from him. She had seen many men like him, men who swore they didn't mean to do it, who claimed it was an accident, a moment of rage, a lapse in control. But something about William felt different. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even defensive. He was lost. "William," she said softly, sliding a cup of coffee across the table, "I need you to tell me what happened tonight." He didn't reach for the coffee. His hands shook slightly, the chains rattling against the metal table. "I don't remember all of it," he said after a long pause. "We were arguing again. She came home late. I was worried. I just wanted to talk, but she kept yelling. She said things she didn't mean, then..." He trailed off, staring at the wall as if the rest of the memory was hiding there. "I blacked out," he whispered. Harris watched him carefully. "You blacked out?" He nodded. One moment she was standing there. The next she was on the floor. "I tried to help her. I swear to God I tried." His voice cracked on the last word. Tears welled in his eyes, but he didn't wipe them away. Harris took notes quietly. She'd heard versions of that story before, but the details needed to match the evidence. "William," she said gently, "there were no signs of forced entry. Nobody else was in that house. It was just you and Emily." He looked down at the table, his jaw trembling. "I know," he whispered. "It was just us." While Harris questioned him, the forensic team was still at the house. The living room had become a crime scene, every inch of it photographed and cataloged. Detective Raymond Knox was there again, his heart heavy as he watched the team work. They collected blood samples, bagged the broken picture frame, and dusted for prints that all turned out to belong to William and Emily. On the desk in her bedroom, they found something unexpected. A folded piece of paper addressed simply, "To Mom." The letter was dated 3 days before her death. The handwriting was neat but uneven in places, the words written with a heavy hand. "Dear Mom," it began, "I miss you more every day. Dad's been different lately. He gets angry so fast and I don't know how to talk to him anymore. Sometimes I think he looks at me and sees you. I wish he could see me instead. I know he loves me, but it feels like that love is too heavy to carry. He watches everything I do, and when I try to tell him I need space, he says I'm being ungrateful. I'm scared of what he might do if I ever really leave." The detectives read it in silence. The letter wasn't a confession, but it was a window into the tension that had been building in that house. At the bottom, Emily had written something softer, something almost hopeful. "I still believe he can change. I have to believe that because I'm all he has left and he's all I have left too." When Harris brought up the letter during questioning, William's eyes filled again. "She wrote that?" he asked quietly, his voice shaking. "She thought I'd hurt her." Harris hesitated before answering. "She said she was scared of your temper." William closed his eyes, leaning back in the chair. "She was right to be scared," he said finally. "I wasn't myself anymore." He began to talk then, not the rehearsed kind of talking people do when they're trying to defend themselves, but the unfiltered kind that spills out when there's nothing left to lose. He told her about the years after his wife's death, about how he'd poured everything into raising Emily, how she became his reason for getting up every morning. But as she grew older, he felt her slipping away, becoming someone he couldn't control or protect. "It started with small things," he said. "She'd come home late, talk back, lie about where she'd been. I thought I was doing what any parent would do. But then she started looking at me differently, like I was the enemy. I didn't know how to stop it. Every time I tried to hold on, she pulled further away." Harris asked him about the argument that night. His memory came in fragments. "She told me she wanted to leave, said she was going to live with that boy. I lost it. I told her she was too young, that he didn't care about her. She screamed that I was ruining her life. I remember reaching for her arm just to stop her from walking out the door. I didn't mean to hurt her, I didn't want her to go." His voice broke again and he covered his face with his hands. "I didn't mean for any of this." Meanwhile, the media began to swarm outside the station. Reporters from Norfolk, Virginia Beach, and even Richmond were camped out on the steps, their microphones ready, their cameras pointed toward the entrance. The story had all the makings of a tragedy that would grip the public. A loving father, a rebellious daughter, and a family destroyed from the inside. People wanted answers, but the truth was messy, complicated, and soaked in grief. As the days passed, more details emerged. Friends of Emily came forward, describing her as bright, kind, and restless. Her best friend, Melissa Andrews, told investigators that Emily had confided in her about the tension at home. She loved her dad, Melissa said through tears, but she was scared of him too. She told me once that when he got angry, it was like a switch flipped inside him. He'd get quiet and his eyes would go cold, but the next morning he'd act like nothing happened. Ryan Mitchell, the boyfriend, was questioned as well. He looked shaken, his voice trembling as he spoke. "She wanted to leave home," he said. "She was saving money. We were going to get a place together after she turned 18. She said her dad would never let her go if she told him." The detectives checked his alibi. He had been working the late shift that night. There was no sign he'd been anywhere near the Carter house. The more they learned, the more the story began to make sense, though no one wanted to admit it out loud. William hadn't planned a murder. He hadn't set out to kill his daughter. But years of grief, loneliness, and fear had built into something volatile. A man who couldn't let go had finally lost control. When the trial began months later, the courtroom was packed. The prosecution painted William as a man consumed by possessiveness, unable to accept that his daughter was growing up. They spoke of the bruises, the arguments, the control. The defense told a different story. A grieving father who had made one terrible mistake in a moment of emotional collapse. They called it an accident. The jury listened to every word, their faces pale and tight. Emily's letter was read aloud in court. Her words echoed through the room, soft and heartbreaking. When the line came, "I have to believe he can change," several jurors wiped away tears. William wept openly, his hands shaking as he listened. After deliberation, the jury found him guilty of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. When the judge read the sentence, William didn't look angry or surprised. He just nodded slowly as if he had expected it all along. "I deserve it," he said quietly as the guards led him away. In the years that followed, the story faded from headlines, but in Chesapeake, people still remembered. The Carter house remained empty for a long time, the windows boarded up, the lawn overgrown. Some said they could still hear the faint sound of a music box late at night, drifting from inside. Emily's favorite tune, the one her mother had given her. And for those who passed by, it was impossible not to think about how quickly love could turn into tragedy. How easily a heart could break when it tried too hard to hold on to what it could never keep. The courtroom emptied slowly after the verdict, the sound of footsteps echoing off the marble floors. Reporters lingered outside, shouting questions that no one answered. Inside, William Carter sat motionless, his hands folded in his lap as if still in prayer. The words "life in prison" hung in the air like a ghost he couldn't shake. When the bailiff touched his shoulder, he stood without resistance. His face was hollow, his eyes unfocused, as though he were looking at something no one else could see. Maybe he was. Maybe he was seeing that night again. The light flickering in the living room, Emily's terrified face, the sound of her name leaving his lips for the last time. They led him through the narrow hallway to a holding cell, where he sat alone until the sun began to rise outside the barred window. He didn't cry anymore. He had cried every tear his body could produce. Now there was only silence, the kind that comes when the world you knew has been stripped away piece by piece. In that silence he thought of her. Not the way she had looked that night, but the way she had been before everything fell apart. Running barefoot through the backyard, her laughter filling the air, her hair tangled by the wind as she called out for him to chase her. He used to tell her she reminded him of her mother. Now he wondered if that comparison had been a curse as much as it was love. Weeks passed before William was transferred to Greensville Correctional Center, a sprawling concrete complex surrounded by razor wire and empty fields. His days fell into a slow rhythm, waking before dawn, eating meals that tasted like cardboard, spending hours in silence among men who carried their own ghosts. He didn't talk much. The guards called him Quiet Carter. Some inmates tried to test him at first, but his stillness unsettled them. He wasn't angry, he wasn't defiant. He was simply broken, and there's something about that kind of brokenness that makes even hardened men look away. At night, when the lights went out and the prison fell into uneasy sleep, William would write letters. He wrote to Emily as if she were still alive. He filled notebook after notebook with apologies and memories. How proud he had been the day she learned to ride her bike. How scared he'd been when she caught the flu at age 9. How sorry he was for letting his grief turn into anger. The letters always ended the same way. "If there's a heaven, I hope you know I loved you more than anything." He never sent them, of course. There was no one to send them to. But writing was the only thing that kept him from drowning completely in regret. Years blurred together. Outside the prison walls, the story faded. New tragedies filled the news, and the Carter case became just another sad headline from the past. But for those who lived on Maplewood Drive, the memory didn't fade so easily. The White House where it all happened sat empty for years, its windows boarded, its yard wild with weeds. Some nights the neighbors swore they saw a light flicker in the living room, even though there hadn't been electricity there in a decade. Others said they heard faint music, a soft melody that drifted out onto the street before vanishing again. Margaret Lewis, who had been the first to call the police that night, refused to walk past the house after dark. "That place still cries," she once said. Eventually, the property was sold to a local contractor who planned to tear it down. He didn't know the full story at first. When the workers came with their equipment, they joked and laughed, unaware of the history buried beneath the walls. But as they began dismantling the house, the laughter faded. In the corner of what had once been Emily's room, under a loose floorboard, one of the workers found a small wooden music box wrapped in an old handkerchief. The wood was chipped, the paint faded, but when he turned the small metal crank, the box came to life with a delicate tune, "You Are My Sunshine." Inside was a photograph, yellowed with age, of a man and a young girl standing on the beach, smiling against the backdrop of an orange sunset. On the back of the photo were 4 words written in blue ink, "For when I'm gone." The discovery made its way into the local paper, reigniting old memories. Some saw it as a sign of forgiveness, others as a haunting reminder that some wounds never truly heal. The music box was eventually given to a local historical society, where it sat behind glass with a small card that read, "Found at the Carter residence, 1987 tragedy." Visitors who passed by often lingered in front of it longer than they meant to, listening to the faint melody that still played when wounded. Meanwhile, in prison, William grew older. His hair turned gray, his body thinner. He rarely spoke except to the chaplain who visited his cell once a week. The chaplain said that William carried his guilt like a man carries a stone in his chest, always there, pressing down, impossible to set aside. "Do you think she forgives me?" he asked one evening, his voice trembling. The chaplain hesitated before answering. "That's not for me to know," he said gently. "But I believe love is stronger than anger, even in death." William nodded slowly, though the words offered little comfort. He began to spend his time carving small wooden figures from scraps he found in the workshop. Birds, stars, hearts. He gave them away to anyone who asked, never keeping any for himself. When a younger inmate once asked why, he said quietly, "Because holding on hurts." The boy didn't understand then, but years later he would remember those words whenever he thought about the quiet old man in cell 214. In 2015, nearly 3 decades after the murder, William Carter passed away in his sleep. The guards found him with a notebook on his lap, a letter half written inside. It was addressed, as always, to Emily. The last lines read, "I see you in every dream now. You're smiling again. Maybe this time I'll get it right." The letter was never mailed, but the chaplain arranged for it to be placed with his few remaining possessions: a watch, a photograph, and a small wooden heart he had carved himself. When the news reached Chesapeake, few people remembered the details anymore, but those who did felt a quiet sadness. The Carter tragedy had never been about evil or malice. It had been about grief. Grief that had rotted into obsession, love that had curdled into control. It was a reminder of how the human heart, when broken and left unattended, could become something dangerous. After William's death, the new family that had built their home on Maplewood Drive began noticing strange things. Some nights the faint sound of a lullaby drifted through the air, soft and sorrowful. Sometimes they found the front porch light on when they were sure they had turned it off. Once the mother of the family found a small wooden bird resting on the windowsill. She didn't know where it came from, but she kept it there, saying it brought her peace. Years later, a writer researching local crimes visited the old neighborhood. He spoke to the remaining residents, piecing together fragments of memory, and when he stood outside the rebuilt house, he said it felt heavy there, as though the air itself remembered. He wrote an article titled, "The House That Still Breathes," ending it with a simple reflection. Sometimes love doesn't die with the body. It lingers, waiting for forgiveness it will never receive. And perhaps that was true, because somewhere in that quiet Virginia evening, The wind still carried faint traces of a father calling his daughter's name. A sound no one could quite explain, but everyone could feel. And if you stood still long enough just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, you might swear you could hear it too. The soft strains of a music box playing a song that once meant everything to a family now lost to time.